Hello everyone, and welcome to the Research Papers Finals. My name is Ben Bohr, and I am the lead of the Research Papers team here at Sloan. And it is with pleasure that I introduce the finalists today. And so before we get started, a couple short logistics. The presentations will last 10 minutes, followed by a Q&A session of about 5. And it'll be judged by a distinguished panel of judges today. So we have Professor Robert Freund of MIT Sloan, we have Nate Silver of 538, and we have John Farisi of Ticketmaster. And please join me in thanking them for volunteering their time today. So the research papers field this year was incredibly competitive. We had over 200 submissions, and we used over 30 academics to kind of figure out who the best of the best were. We had 8 present yesterday, and the best are now presenting today, 4, 1 per track. So we have a baseball paper, a basketball paper, business of sports, and other sports. Now, we randomized the order in terms of who goes first, and to kick us off today, we have Avery McIntyre and Jenna Weens presenting on basketball.
All right, so thank you especially to everyone who was already here yesterday. Really appreciate everyone coming out again today. This is our talk on recognizing and analyzing ball screen defense in the NBA. A little overview of what we're going to be going through. I'll cover exactly what the system was that we built. Professor Weens will pick it up for the second half, talking about how we applied the system that we built to multiple seasons worth of NBA data. So again, we'll start with a quick hypothetical. Say that you have a theory that with the rise of, say, improved three-point shooting in the NBA, teams are choosing to go over on-ball screens more often. And this is a hypothesis that you like to investigate in say a comprehensive way by looking at data across multiple seasons and really trying to get a good answer to this question. Well, if you think about it, it would be pretty difficult, right? Just with the length of the NBA season and the number of games that every team plays, even if you knew where all the ball screens were, answering a question like this would be really difficult. So what we set out to do was build a system that would automatically identify the way in which on-ball screens were defended. And specifically, I'm talking about this sort of system here. So in the top in the red, you'll see a system that was presented at this conference 2 years ago by McQueen and others. And what that system did, it took in raw sport view position data and output a list of all of the on-ball screens that were contained within that data. We've extended that system here in the blue, and we've said, well, for every on-ball screen, how was that screen defended? And we're labeling those instances of on-ball screens with the scheme that was used. So the full system as it works takes in raw sport view position data, returns you a list of on-ball screen instances, as well as the way in which it was defended. So which defensive schemes are we talking about? Let's go back one. Specifically, we're talking about the 4 broad categories shown here, the schematic shown here: over, under, switch, and trap. In the previous version of the talk, we mentioned that there are really a lot of sort of intricate schemes that an NBA coach might choose based on how they specifically want to influence the offense. Right, so say that you want to push the ball handler towards the sideline, you may choose to ice the screen. So why do we choose to focus on these 4 broad categories? Well, we think it actually encompasses quite a bit of the variation, and let me try and explain that here. Really, it comes down to when we're thinking about how things fit into these 4 schemes, it comes down to whether or not the matchups were maintained. So let's take the example of a hedge, right? So the hedger will step out, prevent the ball handler from progressing towards the hoop, and then step back in. So ultimately, the matchups were maintained in that situation, and we're calling it either an over or an under. Let's say, on the contrary, the hedger steps out, does not return to their original matchup. Matchups were not maintained, that's a trap. So if the matchups were maintained, over, under, matchups were not maintained, that's a trap. So that's what we built, a system for automatically recognizing on-ball screen defense as one of these 4 schemes. How do we build it? We treat it as a multi-class classification problem, so that means for every instance of an on-ball screen, we're calling it either over, under, switch, or trap. And the way that we classify it is for every instance of an on-ball screen, we generate 180 features, which are based on the pairwise distances, so basically how the distances between players evolve over the course of the possession, between the ball handler, the screener, the on-ball defender, the screen defender, and then also the ball and the hoop. So the pairwise distances between those entities form sort of the substance of our 180 features. And in terms of learning the model, we need to try and figure out how important are each of these features in determining what scheme is actually being used. In order to learn that set of parameters, learn that set of feature weights, we minimize the multinomial logistic loss function, and that gives us essentially our model that we can use to classify new examples of on-ball screens. So how well did this classifier do? Well, just two things to keep in mind here. Recall, we're talking about how well does our classifier recognize a given scheme. And precision, we're saying how true are the labels that we're assigning to new schemes. So those are the two metrics that we're talking about here. And you can see that relative to the fraction of examples, relative to the distribution of schemes, right, how often one scheme, say, over occurs versus another, say, under, we perform relatively well in terms of classifying them. That said, we had too few examples in our training data of trap to have meaningful analysis. And Professor Wiens is going to pick it up to talk about some really cool analysis that we did with this, and it'll focus specifically on over, under, and switch.
Thank you. So we applied our defensive scheme classifier to 5 seasons worth of data that consisted of over 3,800 games. And we identified 340,383 instances of the defense going under, over, or switching. And we looked at ball screen defense from 3 different perspectives. From the perspective of the team or the league, and then from the perspective of the individuals. The individuals both on offense and on defense. So let's start by looking at trends across seasons. So we had SportView data going back to 2011, and we looked at all the data collected since then up to more or less today. And the first thing we did was we looked at how often teams were choosing to run different schemes and how those choices varied across the seasons. So here I'm plotting the ratio of over to under across seasons. And what we see is that teams in more recent seasons are choosing to go under more often, which is surprising given the recent trend in perimeter shooting in the NBA. So let's look at this from the perspective of outcomes or events. So specifically, consider the probability of taking a 3 and how that probability changes depending on what the defense does. Not too surprisingly, when the defense goes under a screen, the offense is more likely to take a 3. But they're also more likely to make that 3. So perhaps what we're seeing is the offense adapting and capitalizing on choices made by the defense. We can also look at what individuals and duos are doing on offense. So consider the topic of a recent ESPN article that asked the question, who's the better duo in the NBA? Westbrook and Durant or Curry and Draymond? We can answer this question from the perspective of who's better at running the ball screen. We looked at 1,667 instances of Curry and Draymond running the ball screen and 1,152 instances of Westbrook and Durant running the ball screen. And compared to Westbrook and Durant in terms of average points per possession, when Curry and Draymond run the ball screen, they come out ahead in terms of all schemes. So it doesn't really matter what the defense does. However, the difference is greatest when the defense goes under the screen. So how much of this difference is due to the fact that perhaps Curry and Draymond have simply perfected the ball screen versus their teammates? How much of this is due possibly to their teammates? So we can look at that too by considering all other instances where some other duo runs the ball screen. So not Curry and Draymond, not Westbrook and Durant, but some other duo on the Warriors or OKC. And we see that Curry and Draymond have a positive effect. They result in a higher average points per possession when they run the ball screen versus another duo for their team. We don't see the same trend for OKC. Westbrook and Durant really only have a positive effect when the defense switches. They actually do worse than their teammates when the defense goes under. And this might be because we're only considering instances where Westbrook was the ball handler. We can also look at what the defense does when they see each of these different duos. And they do different things. And what these numbers suggest is that perhaps coaches know what they're doing, at least when it comes to Curry and Draymond, since they're going over screens more often, or encouraging their players to go over screens more often. So why are we even asking this question of Westbrook and Durant versus Curry and Draymond? There are other duos who stand out. Well, Curry and Draymond are still at the top of this list in terms of average points over and under. But we also see near the top of this list, Curry and Andrew Bogut. We see Curry and David Lee. So Curry clearly dominates on offense, but other duos stand out. We've got Chris Paul, DeAndre Jordan, Jrue Holiday, Anthony Davis. These are really good duos at running the on-ball screen. So now that we've looked at who's the best on offense, we can also look at who's the best on defense. And what was interesting was when we asked this question, who's the best duo at defending the ball screen, we saw different duos come out on top depending on what scheme we were looking at. So when we looked at over, Avery Bradley and Jared Sullinger were the best at defending the ball screen. But when we looked at under, Rondo and Chandler were better. And yesterday, at the end of the talk, we got a question about how James Harden does on defense. And I'll come to that a little bit later, but I want to point out one more thing. Switching between these two lists, you'll notice there's one pair that appears on both lists, and that's Klay Thompson and Draymond Green. They're really good at running both of these schemes. So back to the James Harden question. So it turns out he's not fighting over screens as much as other players in the league. In fact, he's going under screens 40% more often than the league average. So I could keep going, and I could show you tables of duos that defend best against switch, duos that do best when defended with switch, individuals on offense. I could show you trends across seasons. But the point is that this is just a sliver of the analysis, a sliver of what's possible. These machine learning tools enable automation and data generation in a really unprecedented scale. And this can lead to insights that can help coaches, that can help teams, that can also help fans decide who's better. And with that, I'd like to thank the NBA for access to the data and invite my co-authors up on stage to help answer questions. Thank you. Oh, and I would like to point out, or going back a few slides, where was it? This slide here has changed ever so slightly from the talk we presented yesterday. Scott Brooks pointed out a typo. There's actually not a third Gasol brother. PowerPoint had auto-corrected Pau Gasol's name, so.
Thank you. So questions from our panel of judges.
So you had mentioned the over-under trend and how it was more under, a pretty significant shift over the last 4 or 5 years. What is the trend on the effectiveness? Is over in terms of the average points and under in terms of the average points, does that stay flat over the 5 years, or have you seen a shift on that?
That's a great question. And you know, there are so many questions we can answer with these data. We didn't get a chance to look at everything, but that's something we could sit down right after this talk and answer with these data.
Yeah,
but I just don't have an answer off the top.
Why that trend to go under, to your point, doesn't make sense with the...
Yeah.
Agreed. It really seems totally illogical.
There were some theories, though, from the audience yesterday.
Yeah. And if you want to wait, we can tell you about 15 minutes after the talk is over.
To classify these, you start out with the training set that a human evaluator looked at and said, this is different. Okay. So we're kind of looking at our sheets say new, true, and important are these three categories. So I'm trying to think about questions in each vein. So I'll ask like a important question here. So it's cool to see players who are good and bad at different aspects of the game that are maybe underappreciated. But what are the strategic implications for this? If you're Daryl, Maury, or a coach, what should you do differently as a result of having read this paper?
So, I'm not a basketball coach. I think that I would love to sit down with coaches and pour over this data. I think that it's important to get this in the hands of coaches and let them make what they want of it. Can I answer the question, how should you defend Curry? That's a really hard question to answer. Based on the data, it looks like fighting over those screens is the right thing to do, but that's hard to say looking at just the data, right? We do need the coach's perspective.
So to answer your explicit question, if I were Daryl Morey, I might wonder why James Harden isn't fighting through more screens. And show him at least the evidence that he's not, and try and persuade him that maybe he's not playing defense the way we'd all like him to. So I think there's a lot of that coaches could use to make points with individual players. And perhaps even as a team strategy to say, we got to spend more time in practice going over, because it seems to work better than going under.
So thank you very much. Very interesting talk. So as someone whose background is not in basketball per se, I guess I want to ask you, what made you choose the specific topic of looking at over-under screens as opposed to other defensive plays or offensive plays that you could have gotten good data from the video?
About half of the offensive plays, possessions in an NBA game are on-ball screens. So it's clearly the most important play to defend. It's run far more often than anything else. And in fact, more often every year. There's the current trend where they're trying to space the offenses. The on-ball screen has become just a staple. So we chose it as what we thought was the most important thing to look at.
Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking our presenters.
Thank you.
Next up, we have the Business of Sports paper track, and delivering his talk is Peter Ibarra, and it's on brand engagement within stadiums. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
This is up there quickly. Okay. Hi, my name is Peter Barba. I'm a data analyst at Distillery, as you can see up there. Our paper was through the business of sports, and what we're going to be talking about today is using digital media signals gathered directly from audiences seen at the Major League Baseball season, and seeing what kind of audience profiles that we can develop, as well as understand the way that they're interacting with the brands that are sponsoring each of these teams. As we all know, hundreds of millions of dollars are budgeted each year by corporate brands on team sponsorships, but few quantitative methods exist by which they can validate some of those expenditures. What our research is going to show is that we can use the digital media signals gathered by the MLB attendees to create audience profiles and really find some unexpected insights, but also to see how they're interacting with the corporate brands in the digital media world. So who is Distillery? Distillery, first and foremost, is a technology and data science company. What we do as part of our core business is working with brands to develop and execute their digital media strategies. And this can be across a wide variety of things. It can be on standard desktop campaigns, so like ads you'll see on the side of websites, but it also can be on the mobile or tablet environment as well. And what we get with this core business is 40+ billion data points a day across all the devices that we were talking about, across desktop, mobile, tablets. So we really get a full and rich view of the way that people are interacting with the digital media world. So with this, what we're able to say is part of the data that we receive every day, part of that 40 billion data points, is location data that's shared via the mobile devices. And what we wanted to do is use the mobile devices that people have with them every day to see where in the physical world are they showing up. So when you use your mobile device, if you're on an app, have you ever seen the question that pops up, can we use the location services that are provided? And when you click yes, we can start to see where in the physical world that you're going out. So what we wanted to do is seeing which devices are showing up at each Major League Baseball stadium. So what you see here is a centroid with a custom radius built around it. And what we wanted to do is say, okay, at each stadium, let's create that custom radius to really capture the audience that are attending these games. Depending on where the stadium was, whether it's in a high urban environment with a lot of like public transit, housing, whatever it may be, we would create that tight radius, which is kind of what you see here with Citi Field. But in other areas where it's maybe more parking lots where teams can have like the tailgating, stuff like that, we may have expanded it out. But we really wanted to see that the people that are there are actually at the game. So this geofence that you see was actually custom built for each Major League Baseball stadium. On top of that, we are also able to say, okay, not only do we want to capture people at these locations, we want to ensure that it's occurring as a game is happening. So each device that was collected throughout the season was was happening as the game was occurring. Depending on upon the stadium, we saw anywhere from 250 to 300 unique devices per game. But as I said just a little bit ago, we wanted to use these as a source just to see where they're appearing in the physical world. That's not the full data set of what we have. So what we did is we used a probabilistic device graph, or something that we call the crosswalk. And what that does is it's able to see that if a user is using a mobile device, what other devices are they using to connect to the digital media world, whether it's their desktops at home, their tablets while they're traveling, whatever it may be. We wanted to use that information to see how are they really interacting when they're not at the stadium? Because the things that a user is looking at on their phone while at a game is going to be very different than what they're doing in their everyday lives. We wanted to capture that rich data set. So by using this crosswalk, we were really able to use that entire 40 billion data points we receive every day to start understanding the audiences that are attending these games. So now that we have this full breadth of the online content that they're visiting, we need to understand and start to rank how each of these pieces of content are being visited by each MLB audience. So that's what you're seeing here. What we wanted to do is capture the probability that that audience is going to visit a piece of content. So as an example, we can say, what is the probability that the Seattle Mariners fan base is visiting HuffingtonPost.com? We then take that probability and calculate it against the probability of the general population's likelihood of visiting that same URL, and we can then say they're half as likely, twice as likely, or 5 times as likely as visiting that piece of content. Not only that, so we can do that for individual URLs, but we've also devised a way by which we can describe a collection of URL visits as a type of audience. So as an example, if you visited MLB.com, Baseball Prospectus, and a fantasy league that you're part of, we can see that congregation of websites and say that that person's a part of the online baseball audience. And that is something that we called crafted audiences. And we did it across a wide variety of topics. So when we start to look at stadium attendees and we look at the indices, we can look at the crafted audiences that we were just described. So we see here are the San Francisco Giants and the Minnesota Twins. And we really see some distinct differences between the two, even though they're both fan bases of Major League Baseball teams. On the left, we start to see what other sporting events or sporting teams are they a part of. The Giants, they're part of the NBA. Obviously, the Warriors, it makes sense. On the other side, with the Twins, we see that the NCAA and the NFL are the sports that this fan base is watching when they're not attending the Major League Baseball games. But let's go deeper than that. Obviously, these are sports fans. Let's see what other interests they have, and that's some of the really exciting things that our data is able to show us. So for the San Francisco Giants, we see that they're techies, they're ad agency professionals, and being that they're near the Silicon Valley, it makes intuitive sense that those types of audiences would pop up. But even more exciting is on the other side with the Minnesota Twins. You look at retail women's fitness, you look at retail jewelries and watches, retail yoga, things that people are in market for. As many as 6 of 12 of these audiences, 50%, can likely be contributed to a female consumer. When you have this type of data that's really able to capture the breadth of the online digital behavior, you can start to see these profiles that come up and really understand how to market to the fan bases and the people within those fan bases. And that's very exciting. Now, obviously the difference you see here can likely be attributed to the differences in location. But what we also found is that location isn't the only factor. Stepping away from Major League Baseball for a second, what we're looking at here is a location at the Dover, Delaware Speed Track. And what we see is that it occurred over the weekend, but we're seeing 3 different events happening at the same location. And what's exciting about this is that we can pick up distinct differences between the audiences, even though it's happening at the same location. We see NASCAR events, they're very much into the racing content. We look at the 2 music festivals. Even between them, we see some really unique insight. We see with the Firefly Music Festival, it's a younger audience. They're also looking at what other festivals can we attend? What other things can we go out? And it's a very similar experience to here. And that's different than the Big Barrel Music Festival. We see that let's see what their other interests are. We see that they're into hunting, they're into fishing. But this is where it gets a little bit interesting as well. If you look at like dogfish.com or Wings to Go, we start to see some of the brands that these people are interacting with online when they're not at these events. And that's where it gets interesting to dive into how they're interacting with corporate sponsors. So now that we understand that our data can bring about that nuance, we can then start to build these online audience profiles for each fan base. So we look here, we can say, not only is this the Kansas City Royals fan base, who are they and what are the things that they care about? They're working parents, they're fitness enthusiasts. But what are their interests? They're grill masters, they're moviegoers, they're in market for auto. All data points that are relevant for sponsors that are looking to capture that audience. So when we say that, okay, we have this stuff for each and every team, what can we do with that data? Well, we can work with teams and say, help us describe our fan base. And we can go to them and say, these are the people and corporate sponsors that you should go and partner with. And really make those, didn't click through there. But we can really make those connections. So you see actually a couple existing sponsorships here. The Yankees, their audience is actually indexing for sporting goods wares. They do have that model sponsorships. Perhaps that sponsorship is impacting the online engagement that they're experiencing. But we can look at 2 other ones. The Seattle Mariners, they're a tech-savvy fan base. And on the other side, the Detroit audience is they're do-it-yourselfers. We can help forge those relationships. And this is exciting to do, but it's not the important thing here. Because what we want to bring is not just show these types of insights, but really validate these types of insights. And we're able to do that when we're able to track the differences in engagement over time. What you can see here are 3 separate teams that have corporate sponsors. And what we're saying is the index over time is a general increase in that index. And the important thing to remember is that what our index is showing is a probability. So it's not saying that people are visiting more often. It's saying that more people within that audience are starting to engage with the corporate sponsors themselves. And that's a really exciting thing because it brings that quantitative analysis that marketers are looking for. And we think that our sponsorship, as more and more money is spent every year, can ensure that that money is being spent in smarter ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now questions from our panel of judges.
So I think I missed it in the beginning, but you were talking about you've geofenced a stadium, you've time banded it as well.
Mm-hmm.
What was the sample size on average that you were getting for a game like that? Was it 40 to 50, or did I mishear that?
It was, depending on the stadium, it was anywhere from 250 to 300 unique devices per game.
Per game?
Yes.
Okay. And then if you could talk a little bit about what is different with this than a team just taking its Facebook followers and doing a similar thing, just keeping it all in digital.
Yeah, so one thing I actually didn't mention as part of the presentation is that we saw as much as 30% of an audience at each stadium was a user that showed up one time and one time only. So it's a significant percentage of the fan base that are attending these games. And so I think the difference is when you're looking at like Facebook, these are people that are actively invested in the teams, but we know that those aren't the only people attending the games. And if we can really start to separate out, because like we have the passionate fans, but what about the fans that are going because they're looking to have a good time? We can start to market it in different ways and really understand the nuances between those 2 audiences. So like it's one aspect of what a team can do, but we can bring that other side of the fan base as well.
So I'm not sure if this is a question or like a comment, but
Sure.
I encourage a response either way. But one thing that strikes me is that if I were, for example, the San Francisco Giants trying to figure out who's a good match to advertise in the stadium, I'd find this extremely useful. But it strikes me that sports tickets are very expensive, especially in a venue like San Francisco, and if you were to apply this to basketball or hockey, where to go to a Rangers game costs $200 on average.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if you have like high-end luxury retail or travel showing up a lot, that's because they're categories that also cater to high disposable income fans or food. People are foodies. Well, eating out well is expensive, and so is going to a Mariners game. So I wondered, have you tried to adjust for that, for the kind of bias of which people are able to afford sports tickets versus people who are fans of the team overall?
So in this specific instance, we didn't take a look at like ticket prices by stadium to account for some of the differences that we're seeing in like the socioeconomic factors, I guess you could say. What we wanted to do here more so is we didn't work directly with any of the teams or like the brands themselves. We're working with our the data that we're seeing as part of our core business. Like going into some of those differences that you were talking about, I think actually would not only like enhance some of the things that we're seeing, but help explain some of the differences. Because we're seeing like some upward trends, maybe it's not directly indicative of like corporate brands, but we can start bringing in some of those things and understand those differences. I think is the important thing here is like, we're not directly contributing it, but we can help you understand why these things are showing up. And I think that's the really exciting part here.
So very interesting presentation. So I think it was Einstein, actually, who said, your models should be as simple as they need to be, but no simpler. Right? And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't see much in the way of complicated modeling in terms of, whatever, interesting, logistic regression or anything like that. It just seemed to be, you seem to be doing sort of essentially relatively simple kinds of things, perhaps in a very clever way. But I would just invite you to comment in case I had a misrepresentation of what I saw.
So in this instance, like what we are essentially doing, like you were saying, is like we're just calculating the probabilities and measuring that against like general populations to understand more about those things. Now, when it comes to some of like the crafted audiences stuff, like the aggregation of like the audiences, like so if it's a baseball audience, there actually is more modeling done because what we do there is are taking 3 to 4 websites and saying, that's indicative of this type of audience. What other URLs are also relevant to that audience itself? So even though we're starting with a small set, there are examples of that within here where we're using modeling for that to help understand that full audience. Because just because you visit those 3 URLs doesn't mean that we're understanding fully of what a baseball audience is. So by using it in instances like that, not necessarily in how we're measuring people about whether or not they're in it, but in the building of that stuff is where we start to see some more of those models.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Please join me in thanking our presenter.
Thank you.
I'll introduce you first. Our third presenter comes from the other sports track. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Lucey.
Right, okay, so on behalf of my co-authors, I'm really delighted to present the work that we're doing in predicting behaviours in tennis using tracking data. So essentially, as most of you know, for the last decade or so, we've had this tracking data in tennis called Hawkeye. So it adds really, really nice visualizations and also it helps aid umpiring decisions. On the flip side, IBM have done a great job with this predictive analytics engine called Slam Tracker. So a really good example here is the 3 keys to the game, but for this they only use event-based data. And so essentially the motivation behind this work, let's use the tracking data and do some interesting predictive analytics. So essentially what we're interested in is, I have an example here, we have Federer versus Nadal. We actually want to see who's dominating. So you can think of this as in-point win probability. So we see here in the example, Nadal just hits his very heavy topspin forehand to Federer's backhand. We see that he's dominating the point until he eventually wins the point at the end. So this is essentially what we can do now, given this fine-grained tracking data. And so in the other example that we have here, we have Nishikori versus Nadal. It's a shorter rally. So just say Nishikori serves. There's some slight change in momentum, and then Nadal hits a winner. So this is why we call this the thin edge of the wedge. We're interested in the changes just before they've won the point, okay? And so how we actually did it, so just very simply, you have the Hawkeye data, you can craft some features, and then you put it into a classifier. So the features that we use, so given the raw trajectory data, we can calculate the impact location, the speed, the angles, the player motion. Also, we have these dominance features in terms of speed, depth, angle and lateral ratio changes. So working with coaches at Tennis Australia and the Australian Institute of Sport, these ratios are very informative and these are the things that they relate to the players. And so here's a visualization of some of these features. So here's a probability distribution of Djokovic, Nadal and Federer, and this is when they hit a winner. So I'll just draw your attention to the bottom there. We have Federer. He tends to hit his winners wider of the court, so which makes sense. He has a single hand, forehand and backhand. If I draw your attention to the other side of the slide, we can see that Federer tends to be inside the baseline when he hits his grand strokes, when he hits a winner, also at the net. Nadal and Djokovic are baseliners, so it makes sense they hit the winners far behind the baseline. But also it's interesting to see that Nadal waits for his opponent to be on one side of the court. Again, we're just visualizing these probability distributions for these players against all the other players. And so in terms of our classifier, this behavior is non-linear. So you can map these non-linearities using a decision tree. So this is a classification tree, but we want a probability. So we use a random decision forest. And so that's basically our classifier. And so in terms of training the classifier, we're only interested in the rally. So we disregard the serves. We just want to get the win probability for the rally. And so the data set that we had, so we had 3 tournaments worth of Australian Open data. In total, 10,000 points, nearly 40,000 shots. And the way that we labelled the data, if the player won the point, we labelled all those shots as a 1. If they lost the point, we labelled all those shots as a 0. And so we equally partitioned the data into a training set, evaluation set, and a test set. And because we needed to learn the evaluation, we needed to learn the hyperparameters of our decision forest, this was very valuable. And also, and this is the key point, so I'll touch on this later, we're interested in personalisation. So we focused on these top 10 players because it's a knockout format, and this is how we have most of the data. Okay, so the error, our evaluation was based on the root mean square error between our prediction and actual the label. Okay, now, so it's not 50-50. So as most people here know, the server has the advantage on winning the point. So Carl Bielak from 538 has done some pretty cool stuff on this. So just on the data that we have, it's around 68% of the time, if you get the first serve in, you're going to win the point. For a second serve, it's around 55%. But what's really interesting, if we get out all the aces and the forced errors off the serve, the returnee is actually more likely to win the point. I didn't know this, so I thought this was pretty cool. But that gives us our baseline, so it's not 50-50, so the error, so our baseline's around about 0.53, and so initially we just wanted to check if there was some signal in this. So doing our predictions, we can actually do a better job. But a big problem with this is that there's no personalisation, okay? And so let's go back to our initial example. So we have Federer versus Nadal. If we're going to model Federer, we should just have a model just for Federer. But his behaviour here is dependent on who he's playing. He's playing Nadal, so his behaviour is different. So how can we actually model this? Now, the problem is when we're going to model these things, we're never going to have enough data, okay? It's never going to, as if we're doing for each context, we're just not going to have enough data. So we actually have to be smart with the data. And so this brings in the idea of playing style, okay? So we talk about playing style all the time, but how does that help our prediction? So I have a very simple example here. Federer is my favourite player, so let's use him. So just say, so most people here know that Federer is a serve volleyer, but if we value him on his individual attributes, we can say, well, he's got a great forehand, his backhand's good, but it's not as good as the other guys. Immaculate at the net, great approach shots, Also a great overhead smash. Now just say he's playing Nishikori, okay? How would he prepare as a player? Well, if he hasn't played him before, he could watch tape and he could say, well, his forehand's pretty good, his backhand's really good. And so he could prepare based on learning these attributes. Another thing that he could do, he could say, well, Nishikori plays a lot like Andy Murray, and I've played Andy Murray a lot. I know how to play against him. So essentially, what I can do is draw on all those examples that I've played Andy Murray and build my internal classifier based on those examples. And that's a pretty good prediction. So it's basically an idea of collaborative filtering. So you use it a lot for recommendation systems. We're just applying it here using the tracking data. And so this is really nice. So if we have a decision tree, to learn all these parameters, we're just not going to have enough data. If we have a really nice style vector, we can greatly reduce this. So it makes it allows us to train the model, but also be specific. And so instead of handcrafting these style features, we actually want to learn it directly from data. And so the way that we did this is using trajectory clustering. So initially, we just used k-means clustering, but that only minimizes the reconstruction error. We also want to minimize the prediction error. So you can see, so we use KSVD, which is a dictionary learning method, and so using that, we get much better prediction. And when we incorporate the context, we do better again. And so essentially, we learn 50 shots. We learn individual shots and combinations of shots. And what's really nice, now for every shot a player has, we can represent them as a histogram. So we can do a normalized count of the types of shots, and once we have a histogram, we can start doing comparisons. And so using just the Bhattacharya distance, we can compare style. So for the Australian Open, we can see Federer is close in style to Djokovic, Murray's close to Nishikori, that's why I use that example. We can see Nadal's off by himself. But again, we haven't handcrafted this. We learn it directly from data, it gives us the best prediction. And so here I have some examples. So we'll go back to that second example I showed in terms of predicting the win probability during the point. Using a style feature, we can see that there's actually the momentum changes earlier, okay? Again, we can just do more accurate prediction. And so when we include, so we just compare the two there. So we can see there's a change. And so when we include context, we can actually see, I'll just play both at the same time, context changes the initial probabilities, okay? So even though Nadal is returning, based on all the historical data, we see that he's more likely to win the point, because it's a break point, he's very powerful in those conditions. And so you get really excited about this, because I like stats, but I hate reading spreadsheets. We should use examples. And so it gives rise to the idea of a recommendation system. And so here we show a recommendation system for serves. And so we can say, well, Nadal, on most points, he tends to go down the tee. But on break points, his behavior is opposite. Okay, so you can think of a coach or an analyst actually having a system, and they can say, well, what does this player do in this situation? And then we can find that. And so also you could think of this as a simulation. So given an incoming trajectory, we can plot the probability distributions on what these players tend to do in different contexts. And also, why can't we use predictability as a measure of a player performance? So here we can show that Federer is less predictable than the other players. Also, it adds for very nice specific examples. So instead, again, of just having these tables, we can actually see it, because video examples is the language that we use. So that's basically it. We're really excited about this work. We have this tracking data, but we need to be specific, and via personalization using style, we can do this more accurately. So that's basically the takeaway points. So thank you.
Thank you. And now questions from our panel.
So definitely looks very sophisticated, the kind of tools that you're using. What's the impact?
So the impact is, I've got a slide, I'm glad you asked that. Oh, let's see if I can go to the next slide. So given an example, we can actually be interactive, okay? So the whole idea of we're not going to tell people, we're not going to give them a metric, let them discover that themselves. So not only it's trajectory data, we can let people play around with the data. So the example that I have here is that we've done this for basketball. So just say you could draw a play and you could find all the plays like that. But the really cool thing is now we can start interacting. We can start moving around plays and seeing how probabilities change. And so I think in terms of technology, I think this is groundbreaking because instead of having these spreadsheets, we can be specific. We can model these specific tendencies because that's what this fine-grained data should be used for. Instead of giving these core statistics, it should allow us to model these specific instances. So.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, how much of a factor is, I know you mentioned like the length of the rally, like how much of Nadal's advantage just that he is more fit and plans for long rallies and that, after 8 or 10 strokes, I mean, how much of it is that versus?
Yep, so that's a very good question. So for this work, we just modeled this specific instance, but this is where we have to use long-term models, so recurrent neural nets, long short-term models, to actually model these long-term tendencies. So it's still an open question, and this is something that we're looking at, but that definitely, if you watch the game, that's the case. But how can we model it long-term? So how do we pick it up between match to match, tournament to tournament? Modeling these long-term dependencies is still an unsolved problem, but that's the next step, what we have to do.
So I realize this is very new. Have you had a chance to talk to the players and the coaches, and what's been the acceptance or the reaction?
Yeah, so we're very lucky. So this work was done with Tennis Australia, so Makar Reid, who's one of the head coaches there. So essentially a lot of this functionality is based on the input from the coaches and the players. So again, the feedback that we get is that we deal with video. We deal with these examples. Why can't we do analysis based on that? So a lot of that's just based on that desire to get that done. Yeah.
Thank you. Please join me in applauding Patrick Lucey. Our fourth and final presenter is from the baseball paper track. Please join me in welcoming Brett Green.
Okay, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Jeff Zwiebel, who's at Stanford, and I'm at Berkeley. So the motivation is sort of revisiting an old question. So Nate, when it comes to the new category, we're going to fail miserably on that dimension because this is really an old question. There is this pervasive belief in the hot hand across players, fans, coaches, announcers, analysts, but most of the research finds very little evidence for its existence. And so the question is sort of why, and there's two possible explanations. One is just people are getting it wrong. And this is how the economics literature has interpreted this evidence, and it's been used as sort of motivation for a lot of behavioral economics, that people just sort of misperceive these random sequences as streaks. Another possibility is that the existing literature is sort of missing something. And in this paper, we're going to argue that it's mostly the latter. So one question you might be asking yourself is, why is it so hard to find evidence of a hot hand if everybody believes in it? It is a hard problem. The original focus of the literature was looking at shooting performance in basketball. And there, one of the main issues is that you have these endogenous, both defensive and offensive adjustments. So if a player's hot, the player should shoot more, and the player should take harder shots. The defense should also apply more defensive pressure. Both of these things are going to end up reducing the player's probability of making his or her next shot. So if we don't see a hot hand by looking at outcomes, it could be that it doesn't exist, or it could be that these adjustments impede our ability to detect it. And in fact, in the paper, we argue sort of even more strongly that in basketball, you shouldn't see a hot hand, even if it exists, because of these endogenous adjustments. So in some sense, without really granular data, basketball is not a very good place to look for a hot hand. Another issue that comes up is that you need a lot of data in order to have the statistical power. So based on some of our simulations, we basically need like on the order of 50 to 100,000 observations in order to be able to reject the null hypothesis that there is no streakiness. So that basically requires us to use panel data. You can't look at player-specific data, so we need to run tests on the whole panel of data. But then there's a lot of biases that come up in trying to control for player ability. That is, we want to know whether there's such a thing as a hot hand, but we need to distinguish between whether a player is good and whether the player is hot. Okay, so in this paper, I already argued that sort of looking at shooting performance in basketball is not a very good place to look for the hot hand because of endogenous responses, but that's not true in baseball. Hitters are faced sequentially, defense is optimized, but they do so batter by batter. So the scope for transferring resources across batters is very limited in baseball, unlike basketball. We also have virtually unlimited data, so that's useful when it comes to having enough statistical power. There is one adjustment that defenses in baseball can make and that we don't precisely observe, which is to pitch around a batter. But doing that is costly and it's going to increase the likelihood of a walk. Walks are not going to negatively influence our performance measures, so it's not going to bias us against finding a hot hand. And actually, we're going to use this adjustment to test sort of the fallacy part of the hot hand. Do teams get it right? Do they respond to the hot hand sort of the way that they should be responding? Okay, so we're going to revisit an old question, this hot hand question using panel data from MLB. We're first going to ask, is there evidence of a hot hand, taking into account the main issues that I just mentioned, and if so, how big is it? And then the sort of second question, this is maybe a little bit newer, is are teams responding to this streaky behavior, and are they doing so in a way that looks like they understand the magnitude of the hot hand effect? Okay, so we first have to be precise about what we mean by a hot hand. The term's sometimes used a little bit loosely, so let me just do it with examples. So in 1997, Joey Cora had a streak where he batted .475 over a 24-game span. The rest of the season, he batted .262. That fits most people's intuition about what a hot hand is. This doesn't, which is that in 2011, Chris Davis hit 5 home runs. That was 1 in every 40 at-bats. In 2012, he hit 33 home runs. And in 2013, he had a league-leading 53. That was 1 in every 11 at-bats. People wouldn't say Chris Davis was streaky. He just became a better home run hitter, right? So the way that we're going to define streakiness is going to be relatively high-frequency variation in a player's ability over time. Not increasing year to year, but within a season, variation in a player's ability. Okay, so our framework is to think about a player's success probability as being decomposed into 3 parts. One is the long-term player ability. This might vary year to year, but it doesn't vary within season. This is like a raw talent. This is how fast, how strong the player is, hand-eye coordination. This is only going to exhibit low-frequency variation. The second component is going to be the short-term player-specific component, what we're going to refer to as state. Okay, and that could capture many different things, and we're not really taking a stand on what it is. It could be confidence, it could be attitude, it could be how healthy the player is, but this is the thing that's meant to capture that high-frequency variation in ability, to the extent that it exists. And then a bunch of external factors. That's the opponent that you're playing, the situation, whether there's runners on base, the platoon effect, all sorts of other things. Okay, so we have a very simple regression model where I'm going to regress outcomes, that's y, on a constant plus these 3 components. Okay? And what we're interested in is the gamma times the state. That's the hot hand effect. We do this for 5 different outcomes, both across batters and pitchers, so 10 different statistics, and we're going to include a whole bunch of controls in there, as many as we can. Okay? So how do we measure state? We consider lots of different ways of doing this. We've been thinking about this problem for a long time. The easiest and simplest one that we use is just looking at how well has the player performed recently. Okay, so our measure of state is what's your batting average, or how many times have you gone on base in the last 25 or 10 or 40 attempts. Okay? A second way that we think about measuring the player's state is to call a player hot if his recent performance is above his ability plus some constant. Okay, and vice versa, calling the player cold. Okay, so this is how we're going to measure state. In our main specifications, we consider a bunch of variations of this. And then to measure ability, we're going to look at the current season performance, but we have to exclude a window around the recent history. Okay? And if you don't do that, then you'll end up with a downward bias, and you'll just find a negative coefficient. So this is to avoid finding that having that downward bias. We use a bunch of other measures to try to control for ability, including like previous season, next season, all sorts of things. The main thing is you don't want to overlap your measure of ability with your measure of state. Okay? Otherwise, you end up with a bias. Okay, so what data we look at? We took 12 seasons of Major League Baseball data. That gave us about 2 million observations. And we have a bunch of controls. We got this from RetroSheet. It's free. We're poor academics, so we don't have money to spend on fancy data, unfortunately. What do we find? So we find positive and strongly significant coefficient for all of the 10 categories that we look at. And to get a sense of the magnitudes, we use like a 5% threshold. So we set the constants x and y so that the players are hot 5% of the time and cold 5% of the time. And if we do that, then we get a difference between a hot and cold player, which is about the same as 1 quartile of the distribution. So the difference between a hot and cold player is like the difference between a 75th percentile batter and a 50th percentile batter. We find similar results across both hitters and pitchers, so that's evidence of both a hot arm and a hot bat. And the strongest effects for hitters are in home runs and getting on base. For pitchers, it's in strikeouts and on-base percentage. This is just a summary table. I think given the time, I'm going to sort of skip it. The one number I want to point out is sort of the one that's at the bottom, which says, how big is the magnitude of the hot hand effect? It's between a half and 1 standard deviation in the distribution of player ability. Okay, so that's kind of the magnitude that we're finding. Okay, but when we measure state, this is sort of only a noisy measure of a player's true state, right? So some of the time we're going to call a player hot that's just been lucky, and sometimes we're going to call a player cold that's just been unlucky. And so this is going to lead to some attenuation bias, and to try to figure out how big this bias is, we use a simple 3-state Markov model to get a sense of sort of how large the underlying streakiness in the data generating process has to be to give us the results that we get. And the key parameter in this model is delta, and that's how much higher or how much better you are when you're hot or how much worse you are when you're cold. So what we want to know is what statistical process or what's the magnitude of delta that leads to statistical process that gives us similar results to the estimates that we get when we run the regressions on the MLB data. And what we find is actually that the delta that's consistent with our estimates is about 3 to 5 times larger. So for hitting, the delta is about 45 batting points. So 2 delta, that's the difference between hot and cold, is 90 batting points, so that's a 33% increase when hot versus cold. Of course, no one's ever going to be able to perfectly know whether a player is hot or cold, but an implication of this is if you have some additional information about the player's true state, say you look at their batting practice, then the strategic relevance of this information or of being able to use recent performance to predict future performance is even bigger. Okay, I have very little time left, so let me do this quickly. One thing we also find is that teams respond, okay? They respond to recent, so just like power hitters get walked more, hitters that have hit well, hit a lot of home runs or extra base hits recently, they also get walked more. So this suggests that defenses are responding, that they're pitching around better or hotter hitters leading to more walks. And so what we do is we use these facts to try to figure out whether they're responding correctly. And the basic idea of the test is if opposing teams are making the correct inference about the hot hand, then they should be treating equivalent increases in an expected outcome the same. So whether it's that a batter's hot or whether that the batter's good, they should be pitched around just the same amount. Okay, so that's how our test is going to work. And this table kind of gives you a sense of what we find. So focusing here on the third column, basically this is the regression trying to predict home runs. This is the regression looking at the endogenous response, so how much extra players are walked based on their recent performance. And then what we do is we look at the ratio. Okay, and if teams are getting it right, then these ratios should all line up. Okay, and we were sort of shocked when we saw this, but actually there's no statistical difference between any of these numbers. So it looks like based on the past 25 attempts that teams are responding correctly to recent performance in home runs and similarly in extra base hits. Okay? Now we dig one level deeper and decompose this into not just the last 25 attempts, but into the last 5 and the last 10 attempts. And here we see a slightly different picture. If you look at the ratio, we'll focus on column 6 over here, you'll see that it's much higher on the home runs that you've hit in your last 5 at-bats than it is for 6 to 10, 11 to 15, and all the way down. Okay? And so this is suggestive that teams are, on average, sort of getting it right when they look at the last 25 attempts, but they overreact to performance in the last 5 attempts. All right, so that's it. I'm probably out of time. But just to summarize, is there evidence of a hot hand in Major League Baseball? We find strong evidence for it. The magnitudes are significant, both statistically and strategically, roughly on the order of 1 quartile in the distribution. They're robust across many different specifications. I've spent 5 years trying to find ways to kill these results, and I can't do it. And we also find evidence that defenses respond to this streaky performance. They seem to get it right based on the last 25 attempts, but they tend to overreact to very recent performance. Thanks.
Thank you. And now questions from our panel.
So I didn't realize a lot of the hot hand stuff had been done originally in basketball, and I was surprised that not that much had been done in baseball. But can you speak to what has been done previous to this in baseball?
There's been a lot done in baseball. It would take me a while to summarize all of that literature. The sabermetricians, and we've gone back and forth with the sabermetricians on this a lot. I think the most well-known one is this study in the book by Tom Tango and Michael Lichtman. And there they do find evidence of streakiness, but the magnitudes are smaller. And we've tried to figure out why that's the case. And basically, the way that they're controlling for player ability is leading to a downward bias. And when you correct for that bias, then you end up with numbers similar to ours. Another point to make is that if you ask the sabermetric community now how to predict ability, or how to predict future outcomes, they agree that you want to weight recent performance more heavily than performance from, say, 3 months or 6 months ago. Okay, that to us is the very definition of streakiness. They're calling it something different, but we agree on that.
So I'm kind of a person who is pro hot hand in general, because if we do like ELO ratings and you see that recent performance deserves to be weighted more heavily and so forth, and there's a kind of question about why the null hypothesis should be no hot hand instead of hot hand, I suppose. With that said, I guess I'm wondering, isn't it hard to do this in baseball because there are so many things you have to adjust for, right? So the pitcher, the stadium, times to the order, temperature, number of days on a road trip or on a homestand. I know you said you've been doing this for 5 years, but can you give me kind of a 30-second summary of
the control variables that we use?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right. There's lots of things that you want to control for, and we've tried lots of different controls. The main ones that matter are stadium, pitcher ability, the platoon effect, whether or not they're of the same hand. Runners on base matters for whether a player's walked, not so much for whether he gets a hit. We've thrown everything that we can possibly think of into the right-hand side to control for this. But one point that I would make is, even if we're sort of missing some controls here or there, that won't necessarily lead to biased estimates unless it's somehow correlated with the recent performance. So it's possible that we're missing some things, but that wouldn't necessarily invalidate our results.
I have no question.
Great.
Thanks.
Join me in thanking Brett. Thanks for attending our Research Papers Finals. Please join us at the Alpha Awards later this afternoon, where we'll announce the results. Thank you.